In September 1831, Samuel A. Worcester and a group of white Christian missionaries were indicted in the U.S. Supreme Court for the county of Gwinnett in the state of Georgia for residing within the limits of the Cherokee Nation without a license and without having taken the oath to support and defend the Constitution and laws of the state of Georgia. They were indicted under an 1830 act of the Georgia legislature entitled "An Act to Prevent the Exercise of Assumed and Arbitrary Power by All Persons under pretext of authority from the Cherokee Indians." Worcester was convicted at a trial in 1831 and sentenced to 4 years of hard labor in prison. Worcester then appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court received the case on a writ of error taking place over 3 days, on February 21st, 1832, February 22nd, 1832, as well as February 23rd, 1832, with the final decision being made on March 3rd, 1832.
Before Worcester in Georgia took place, the Cherokees were in the process of restructuring their government while declaring to the American public that they were a sovereign nation. Infuriated by this information, Georgia's legislature responded by trying to extend its claim over the Cherokees who were living in the state's declared boundaries. In the process of extending Georgia's powers, the state annexed the Cherokees' lands and established their government, courts, and laws, while also establishing a process of seizing Cherokee land and distributing it to the statewide citizens. This extension of power led to what we know as the 1830 Indian Removal Act passed by President Andrew Jackson. The Cherokees, led by their principal chief, John Ross, refused to move and filed with the U.S. Supreme Court an action challenging the constitutionality of Georgia's laws. In Cherokee Nation v. Georgia 1831, the court held that it did not have jurisdiction to strike down Georgia's laws, and a dicta that became particularly important in American Indian law. Chief Justice John Marshall wrote that the Cherokees constituted a domestic dependent nation that existed under the guardianship of the United States. Then later became important in the decision of the later case of Worcester versus Georgia.
Samuel Worcester, a native of Vermont, was a minister affiliated with the American Board of Commissions for Foreign Missions. In 1825, the board sent Worcester to join its Cherokee mission in Brand, Tennessee. 2 years later, the board ordered Worcester to the Cherokee national capital of New Echota in Georgia. Upon his arrival, Worcester began working with Elias Bunedet, the editor of the Cherokee Phoenix, to translate the Bible and other materials into the Cherokee language. Over time, Worcester became a close friend of the Cherokee leaders and often advised the Cherokee leaders about their political and legal rights under the Constitution. The Georgia government recognized what Worcester was influential in the Cherokee resistance movement and enacted a law that prohibited white persons from residing with the Cherokee Nation without permission from the state. Georgia gave the missionaries until March 1st, 1831, to obtain a license of residency or leave the Cherokee Nation. Several missionaries, including Worcester, who decided to challenge the law and refused to leave the state. On March 12, 1831, Georgia authorities arrested Worcester, Butler, and several other missionaries and teachers for violating the new law. A Georgia judge released Worcester when his lawyers argued that he served as a federal postmaster at New Echota and was therefore in the Cherokee Nation under authority of the federal government. George R. Glimmer persuaded the United States to relieve Worcester of his postmaster duties and ordered the missionaries to leave the state. 3 of the missionaries gave up the fight and abandoned their missionaries who were later posted on and demanded to leave Georgia. Of course, they refused to leave. So in September of 1831, the missionaries were tried, convicted, and sentenced to 4 years in prison. The missionaries, represented by lawyers hired by the Cherokee Nation, appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, where the court struck down Georgia's extension laws. At the court, Worcester argued that Georgia had no right to extend its laws to the Cherokee territory. He contended that the act under which he had been convicted violated the U.S. Constitution, which gives to the U.S. Congress the authority to regulate commerce with Native Americans. The Constitution also bars the states from passing laws that alter obligations of contracts. In this case, several treaties between the Cherokee and the U.S. government recognized the independence and sovereignty of the Cherokee Nation. Furthermore, Worcester argued that Georgia violated an 1802 Act of Congress that regulated trade and relations between the United States and the Indian tribes.
In an opinion delivered by Chief Justice John Marshall, the court held that the Georgia Act, under which Worcester was prosecuted, violated the Constitution, treaties, and laws of the United States. Nothing that the treaties and laws of the United States contemplate the Indian Territory as completely separated from that of the states, and provide that all intercourse with them shall be carried on exclusively by the government of the Union. Chief Justice Marshall argued the Cherokee Nation, then, is a distinct community occupying its own territory in which the laws of Georgia can have no force. The whole intercourse between the United States and this nation is, by our Constitution and laws, vested in the government of the United States. The Georgia Act interfered with the federal government's authority and was proven unconstitutional. Johnston, Duval, Story, and Thompson agreed, while Justice Henry Baldwin dissented for procedural reasons and on the merits. In the end, however, Georgia ignored the court's decision, keeping Worcester and the other missionaries in prison. Eventually, Worcester and the missionaries were granted a pardon and were finally released in 1833. President Jackson declined the ruling and didn't end up enforcing the Supreme Court's decision, allowing the states to enact further legislation damaging the tribes residing there. The U.S. ended up forcing the Cherokee off of Georgia in 1838, just a few years after the case. They were forced on what is now known as the Trial of Tears. It is presumed that 15,000 Cherokee were forced from their land and were moved west, where around 4,000 Cherokee died. Although the ruling didn't prevent the Cherokee from being removed from their land, the decision was later, often used to craft future Indian law in the United States. The Worcester decision created an important precedent throughout which American Indians could, like states, reserve some areas of political autonomy.